Hi, I'm Derek Robinson, a senior online course developer here at InterSystems, and in this video we're going to take and apply some of the key concepts that you've learned throughout your Health Connect for Implementers program and take them in a real-world scenario and see how they play out. So, to this point in the program, you've learned all about interoperability productions, you've learned about business services, processes, operations, you've learned about HL7 routing rules and business rules in general, and you've learned about data transformations, among a bunch of other concepts as well. So in this scenario, we want to take a bunch of those concepts and see how they play out in a real scenario where you, as an implementer, are trying to set up a system according to one of your client's requests. So let's consider a scenario where your client, labeled by this client system here, your client expects to receive on port 5000 via TCP incoming messages that are HL7 messages of schema 2.3, so version 2.3 HL7 messages incoming on port 5000. What they would like their system to do is smoothly receive those messages and transform them from version 2.3 to version 2.51, and then as an output, send off to a business operation that can output these to either a TCP location, or in this case, we'll just write them to a simple file location that can be the output simulation for what happens downstream with these 2.5.1 newly transformed messages. So this is a really simple scenario, and of course you could build in more logic here where perhaps a business rule or multiple business rules could route these messages based on certain criteria to different business operations. So maybe there's one, maybe alphabetically you split this up and the subject of these messages or the patient in these messages would write out to different groups based on what you kind of had outlined here. But in the basic scenario, we're just transforming and sending to one output location. So what we want to do here as an implementer is we want to be able to set up this interface, a real replica of this interface, without going in and trying to do it in a live system, right? So as a part of that, you need to be able to simulate both ends of the spectrum where these external systems play a part in the story. So let's take a look at what that might look like using a two namespace setup where we can have one namespace replicating your client's eventual system and another namespace replicating your testing environments. All right, so let's take a look at how this actually might play out if you were to set it up in a two namespace environment. So the first namespace we have here is transform data, and this is going to replicate your client's environment. So we're going to build a production that's going to look just like what your client is asking to create in this sample scenario. And namespace number two is going to be called test namespace. Now, test namespace is going to simulate both the upstream and downstream systems that are involved in the scenario that we talked about. Now, as a quick refresher, the little diagram up here reminds you what the original scenario is, which in a nutshell is a system that intakes HL7 2.3 messages, transforms them, and looks to output them as HL7 2.5.1 messages. So let's start by seeing what components we might create within these two namespaces and their productions. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this scenario where this HL7 sample message set can be sitting in a file here for HL7 2.3 messages, and we'll call this business service local HL7. So basically, local HL7 is going to be a business service that scoops up messages from a local file location. For the purposes of testing this, we don't really care where these HL7 messages came from, but this is going to be the upstream system that we're simulating. So it's going to pick up an HL7 message, consume it into this local HL7 service, and then we're going to have a business operation that can be called toSystem1. And what this routing will do is it'll go straight there. We won't even need a business process for the testing portion of this, but we'll go right to HL7 to System 1. So that'll be the first thing that we do to simulate the upstream system. Now let's take a look at the client system, and what the real crux of the client system is this transformation. So before going into the production, let's consider that we create a data transformation called Transform1. Now, Transform1 is going to take HL7 2.3 messages and transform them to HL7 2.5.1 messages. Now, that transformation will be included within the business rule of a business process. And so we'll call this business process here in the middle HL7 DT for HL7 data transformation. So this business process sits in the middle of your client system, and that's going to be what's transforming the messages. So naturally, we're going to build the components on each side of this. So maybe we have an HL7 in business service. And remember, that watches on port 5000 for incoming HL7 messages. And then on the other side of it, we might have a to system 3 operation that will actually be sending messages to the downstream system that we haven't gotten to yet. But that'll be the business operation. And so ultimately, the business process here in the middle will have a source of HL7 in and a target of to system 3, and it'll work on both sides to be able to route those messages accordingly. So now, to this point, our test namespace has really simulated the upstream system, but we can also have this same namespace simulate the downstream system. So if we look at what's left here, we could say, add a service here that we can call from client. And this is going to be a business service that will receive the messages that to system 3 is going to output as a part of your kind of replica of your client system. So we have a from client business service here, and on the other side, we might have a to local business operation that will output these messages at the end of the pipeline to a local folder. So as we look at all of this together, let me use a different color here as we sort of show the workflow through this system. So we have incoming HL7 messages. They pop into a folder on your system right here. And from here, it's going to go up, be consumed by this business service, go across to system 1, and the to system 1 operation is going to then send to port 5000 right here. And so now this is where your client system really kicks in and is acting as a replica of what you'll actually implement in the production system. So on port 5000, it listens, it receives this HL7 2.3 message, passes it along to your HL7 data transformation process. The data transformation here occurs, and on the other side of it, it becomes an HL7 2.5.1 message. So now it arrives at operation to system 3, and this system now is going to send this all the way back down to the from client service that is actually on the same namespace, your test harness namespace, but it's acting as a different system. It's portraying a downstream system instead of an upstream system. So here, from client receives that message, passes it along to the to local business operation, which then can output this to a folder in the end. Now, ultimately, there's a lot of places in this process where you could add additional logic, you could do additional routing, you could send to multiple different destinations. But overall, this is a sample scenario where with 2 different namespaces, you can really simulate 3 systems where your client system interacts with both upstream and downstream systems to play out a relatively reasonable scenario. So this is how you can build this out as a replica and actually test out this system for your client before you actually implement it. Now let's head over to the management portal and see what a system like this might actually look like.
All right, now that we've kind of walked through all of that conceptually, let's take a look at what it looks like in the UI, what it looks like in the management portal as these 2 namespaces, one that replicates your client's system and one that replicates a test environment that has upstream and downstream systems being replicated. So if we start with the management portal, we can see here that I have 2 namespaces. I have test namespace and I have transform data. So transform data is going to be the namespace that replicates the interface you're building for your client, and test namespace is going to be our upstream and downstream kind of test harness space there for being able to have those simulated systems. So let's first start by looking at the test namespace, because that's where our workflow kind of originates. So if I go to interoperability and then configure and production, we can look at what we have here running. And so the first service or component that is at play in our overall workflow here is local HL7. So if I look at local HL7, this is a file service with an inbound adapter. And you can see here that it's looking in this file path, Health Connect 2023 HL7. So that's a file path on my system. If I open up my Finder window here, you can see that I have a sample message that we're going to send into this production a little bit later. And we have HL7 in, HL7 out. So this HL7 in folder is where this business service is looking, waiting to receive an incoming message. You can also see as we look through this system, we've defined that the schema category is 2.3, and we're sending this, the target configuration is sent to system 1, to system 1 operation. So now let's look at the two system one operation. This is a TCP business operation. And as you can see, as we look through, the IP address in this example, we're using just a local setup here. So it's the IP address is itself, but we're sending it to port 5000. So that'll come up in just a moment when we look at where a business service is looking to receive this message, right? But this two system one operation is sending to port 5000 on this IP address. And this would be the case for any other network setup that you'd have. Wherever it's sending its message, it defines your IP, your port, and hopefully on that location, there is a service waiting to receive that message. So for those of you not familiar with this UI as well, you can also click the dots next to these components to kind of see where the routing is set up for this. So from local HL7, there is just one path here, and that's to two system one business operation. So as we look at that, let's kind of hop over now to see where this flow will pick up. So if we go to the transform data namespace and we look at the production that we have here, you'll see that this is really the crux of what we're replicating for our client. Now remember, the use case is we're taking in an HL7 2.3 message and outputting it as HL7 2.5.1. So the first thing that we have is this HL7 in business service. So if we take a look over here at the settings, we can see that it's a TCP service. And right here, we define that it's looking on port 5000 for that message. So that's where we sent from the business operation, we sent to port 5000 where this production is running. And so by looking on port 5000, it knows that it's looking for message schema 2.3 is the type of message that it's going to be receiving and sending. And then we have a target config of HL7 DT. So that's the next step in the process. We look at HL7 DT. And if you recall here, at this point in the process, what we want to do is we want to introduce a data transformation. So I'm going to hop away from the production screen for a moment and let's go look at the data transformation that we're going to put into this process here so that we can transform HL7 2.3 to HL7 2.5.1. So if I look at a data transformation, I have this one open already, and this is called demo.transform1. So if you remember on the Lightboard presentation, transform1 was the transformation that we had pinned to say we're going to put that into our business process. And what we do here is we actually in the transform, when you're creating a new transformation, and I'll kind of click through what it looks like to create a new one as well. So creating a new transformation, you might name this my transform 2. And as you get to create a data transformation, you choose your source type and target type. So what I did for this transformation is HL7 on both scenarios. That's what this video is mainly about in Health Connect, but you can also have X12 and other formats, depending on what your situation is. As we look, we can choose the source class, and here we're choosing 2.3, and I chose an ADT A01 message as the sample that we're going to use here. And so on the target, what we want to do is we want to actually choose a different type. We're using 2.5.1, and we go ADT 2.5.1. So if I click OK, it'll create this new transformation, and now we have a fresh start here, but you can see that the segments in these messages are different because these are different schemas, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the one that I have created already, which is a demo transform 1, and just take a little peek. As we see, we can map the MSH segment to the MSH segment in the source and target. So we do that by clicking and dragging, and it creates a new action. Now I'm going to delete that one because I had already done some of these. But as we look at this, we can see what these actions are in this area down here. So if I look at basically this one, for example, we can see this is the very first thing we have, and it takes the target.msh segment and it sets it to be what the value is in source. So here's the target, and it's setting it equal to what that segment is in the source message. So as you go through, you can choose these segments that you want to map, and really for your use case, you might do a lot of different things with the data transformation here. So for example, this version ID is where the previous message indicates 2.3. So in this case, I didn't want to directly map by doing this. I didn't want to map version ID to version ID because the version IDs are different. So I wanted to take this and I wanted to directly set this as 2.5.1. So you can see right here that this is being set to 2.5.1. If there's another scenario where maybe a segment doesn't exist in one schema versus the other, maybe we look at the EVN segment here. So this segment exists between the two, but you might notice the event facility field is new within this segment. So there's nothing I can't drag. There's no event facility field here to map to this event facility field in 2.5.1. So what I might do if my system requires something to be there and not just receive a null value, I might directly set this to be unknown. That's just a really basic example, but as you can see here, there's nothing to take that value from, so we're going to directly set it to unknown. So as you go and build, there's more learning content, and you've already taken some of this learning content, presumably, on how you can build these data transformations. And then the last thing that we'll do here is we'll just do a quick little test. So as we, let me compile the data transformation first. And so as we compile this transformation and then we run a little test, I've already populated in a sample HL7 message, very similar. In fact, it might be the same message that we're going to send through the system in a moment. But as we can see here, we've got this sample message. And one thing I'll call your attention to first is that it's 2.3 here in the MSH segment. This is identifying the version ID that we talked about. So the incoming message is 2.3. And then we also took a look at the EVN segment, which has, as you can see, nothing after this long ID here. There's really no other values here. So as we run the test of this transformation on this message, I'll call your attention to two things. First, you can see here that 2.5.1, you can see as you hover over it, this is the version ID within the MSH segment. The version ID field has been updated to 2.5.1. And then you'll also see in EVN here, in the EVN segment, we now have unknown listed under the event facility. So this is an example of how this HL7 message has been transformed to now fit the 2.5.1 schema. So this is a super basic example, but there's a lot that you can do with these data transformations the more detailed that you get. So now we have our data transformation, but if we go back over to the production screen that we want to put this transformation into our business process, you can see here in the HL7 DT process that it's actually not going to directly put a data transformation into the process. That's not exactly how it works. But instead, it's actually using a business rule. So pretty much anytime you're going to be applying a data transformation within a scenario like this, it's going to be done via a business rule. And so when we created this process, you can actually auto-create a rule. So if I go to create a new process in the business process wizard, you can choose to auto-create a rule and it will be editable afterwards. And so here I have this basic rule, HL7 DT routing rule. And if I open this up, it's a really simple scenario I've built here just for the demo. But basically, we're saying if true, so the if condition is just having a 1 here. So if true, then the actions that I've put here is send to target message to system 3 with a transform using demo.transform1. That's the data transformation that we just completed. So I've put this data transformation into this business rule, and that business rule is what is being used for this routing business process. So as we look at the routing of this business process, you can see, kind of like we did before, that it receives things from this HL7 in service, and it sends them to the HL7 to system 3. Now that is being pulled from the routing rule. We don't actually have to system 3. As you can see, it's not labeled here as the target. Like there's no singular business operation that we've set as the target for this business process. Instead, the business rules see that to system 3 is the target location that can be sent based on the routing rule that we've put in place. And that's the only operation that this particular routing rule could send to because we didn't have any additional logic there, right? So as we then look at to system 3, we're getting close to the end of our loop here where to system 3 we talked about before is a TCP operation. And in this case, the receiving end of this was receiving on port 5000. Now we're going to send this to port 5001. So at the end, this now has become an HL7 2.5.1 message. We're going to send it out to port 5001, and that's where we can hop over back to our test where the second system is really being replicated. So if I switch to the test namespace and take a look at this production, now we're looking at this service called from client, which is from your client replicated interface that we just walked through. And you can see here, it's a TCP service, and it's looking on port 5001. So that's where the previous business operation is planning to send this message, and this business service is looking for it on port 5001. As we look, the target configuration is to local. So if we look at this map here, we can see it goes right to local. And to local, kind of completing this start to finish journey that we've had, just like the way we started, to local is a file operation, but this time it's a business operation. So it's not scooping up a file from a location, but it's outputting a file to a location. So in this case, we have HL7 out, which is the corresponding folder that I showed earlier. And we have the output message being this generic kind of, it'll say output message with an underscore, and then it has the, I believe that's the date or the timestamp essentially for this file. So it's going to output this HL7 message to that location. So with all of that said, we can now explore what this looks like. So let's pop open our Finder window again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag this sample message into the HL7 in folder. And what should happen here is that it should appear momentarily. And then that business service should scoop this message up. There we go. It's been taken. And as we look very quickly, HL7 out is now populated with this output message with our timestamp here. So as we open this up and as we zoom in, we have these two messages side by side. And what I'll call your attention to are the same things we tested here, where 2.3 was the version ID in the original. We've seen that update to 2.5.1 over here. We also see that that unknown string has been added, and there might have been a couple of other things that I had done during testing as well. So very quickly, we see that this took its journey throughout the system. And the last thing that we can also do is we can take a look at the messages and see the trace of what happened here. So if I look, right here is this most recent message that we got from local HL7. And you can see here, this is the test system's incoming service. And we can see that we got an HL7 message, and it's got the 2.3 schema here, the version ID. And the whole journey on this test system is really simple. It's just from local HL7, it was sent to system 1. But as I look over and switch back to our other namespace, that's where we can get some of the more interesting information here. So if we go to HL7 in, we can look at messages here, and the most recently completed trace here has a little bit more information in it. So we see HL7 in came into this business service and it was sent to this business process, very straightforward. But as we look here, we have actually the auditing of the fact that this went through the HL7 routing rule that we had created. And so the reason, it'll give you the reason of why this condition was met. Rule number 1, when number 1, there were no errors, and then it showed you your return value coming from that data transformation. And then as we go and look at the message that's actually leaving this process and going to that business operation, we can see here it's already at this point has been changed. It's been transformed as it's on its way to the to system 3 operation. We've got 2.5.1 as the version, and we have this unknown field added to the EVN segment. So finally, you can see sort of the confirmation that it's been sent on that TCP outbound adapter. And as we hop back over one more time to our test namespace, we can just look at the final piece of the trace, which is seeing this message that came into the from client service and has that very similar structure to the original incoming test trace. But this time we can see it's from client to local, and it has this updated document type 2.5.1. The version is actually updated in the HL7 message, and the unknown field is there. So that's kind of the walkthrough of what we've done here by creating this sample of these pairs of components on our test namespace that are replicating the system that you have working upstream, that is sending HL7 messages to your integration. And then we have, on the flip side of that, using the same test harness, we have another system being replicated for where your integration is sending those transformed HL7 messages. So hopefully this is a nice little sample use case that can kind of show you some of the real world scenarios that might be at play in really simplified ways for a lot of the concepts that you've been learning about in the Health Connect for Implementers program.